A small, scruffy stray dog sneaks into a grocery store every afternoon, stealing food. At first, it seems like mischief, but when the store owner follows the dog, she discovers a heartbreaking truth that will change everything. Stay with us till the end to hear this incredible story of kindness, mystery, and human connection. In a lively neighborhood filled with street murals and busy markets, a small store stood at the corner. Owned by Evelyn Carter, it had been part of the community for years. Evelyn knew all her customers, greeting them with warm smiles. But recently, she had noticed something unusual. Almost every afternoon, just when the sun softened and the streets calmed, a stray dog would slip into her store. It never caused trouble, no barking, no mess, just quiet steps, a quick grab, and then gone. It always took small packages of food, and Evelyn found herself growing curious. One day, determined to solve this mystery, she decided to follow the dog. As the dog left with a small bag of bread, she quietly walked behind it, keeping her distance. The journey led her through narrow alleys and quiet streets until the dog stopped in front of an old, run-down building. What Evelyn saw next left her speechless. The dog gently placed the food into a worn-out basket at the entrance. Evelyn's heart pounded. Who was this food for? Was there someone inside? Evelyn stood frozen behind the alley wall, her breath catching as she watched the old man reach for the food the stray dog had just delivered. His frail hands trembled as he picked up the small parcel, his face a mixture of gratitude and quiet sorrow. He was thin, his clothes worn and tattered, and his small, dimly lit room looked barely livable. Something about him struck Evelyn deep in her heart. This wasn't just a homeless man. There was a story behind him, one that no one seemed to remember. She spent the next few days following the dog again, watching its routine unfold the same way every time. It would enter her store, carefully take a small item of food, and disappear down the alley to deliver it to the same place. The old man would collect the food, eat a little, and then carefully store whatever remained as if it were a treasure. Curiosity pushed Evelyn to ask around the neighborhood about him. Many shook their heads, uninterested, while others muttered his name, Mr. Harlan. He had been there for years, they said, living quietly, bothering no one. Some claimed he had once been an important man, but no one seemed to know for sure. Most had stopped paying attention to him long ago. Determined to find out more, Evelyn visited the local library, searching through old newspapers and records. What she found made her heart ache. Mr. Harlan wasn't just any man. His real name was Hal Mason. Decades ago, he had been a well-respected shopkeeper, known for his generosity and kindness. In fact, he had once worked in her very own store, back when her parents ran it. Evelyn's hands trembled as she flipped through the faded newspaper clippings. Hal Mason had been a pillar of the community, always ready to lend a helping hand. He had organized charity events, helped struggling families, and made sure no one in the neighborhood went hungry. But then, tragedy struck. A personal loss, one too painful for the articles to fully describe, had changed everything. After that, Hal had disappeared from the public eye, slowly fading into the shadows. Now, he was nothing more than a forgotten man surviving in a crumbling building with only a stray dog to care for him. Evelyn's mind raced with emotions, sadness, guilt, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. How had the world let this happen? How had the same community that once admired him let him slip through the cracks? And most importantly, how had a stray dog been the only one to recognize his need for help? That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Hal Mason sitting alone in that dark, cold room, waiting for the dog to bring him food. He had once been someone who gave everything to others, and now he had no one. She couldn't let it continue. The next morning, Evelyn made a decision. Instead of trying to stop the dog from stealing food, she started leaving extra portions at the back door, making sure it had enough to take to Mr. Harlan. She placed fresh bread, small packets of meat, and even a bottle of water, hoping it would make a difference. But she knew this wasn't enough. She had to do more. So, she reached out to some of the older residents, asking if they remembered Hal Mason. Slowly, stories began to surface. One neighbor recalled how he had once helped them when they had no money for groceries. Another remembered how he used to fix broken fences and repair shoes for free. Piece by piece, the memory of Hal Mason started returning to the people who had long forgotten him. As more people began talking about him, something unexpected happened. A few started offering help. Someone dropped off a warm blanket. Another left some fresh fruit outside his building. The kindness began to spread, just like the stray dog's simple act of caring had. But not everyone saw it the same way. Some business owners felt Evelyn was wasting time. They argued that helping one man wouldn't change anything, that the store should focus on selling, not charity. A few even questioned why she cared so much about an old man who had vanished from society. And then, the threats started. One evening, after closing the store, Evelyn found a note slipped under her door. The message was simple, but chilling. Stop digging into the past. Some things are better left forgotten. Her heart pounded. Who had sent it? And why? But instead of fear, she felt something else. Determination. Someone didn't want her to help Mr. Harlan. Someone wanted his story to stay buried. But Evelyn wasn't going to stop. She had already come too far, and now she understood the truth. This wasn't just about one forgotten man. This was about how a community chooses to care for its own. And Evelyn was about to make sure they remembered. Evelyn didn't let the threats shake her resolve. If anything, they only strengthened her determination. Someone wanted to keep Hal Mason's story buried, but she wouldn't let that happen. The stray dog had done more for him than any human, and that was a truth she couldn't ignore. She had to take action. She started by gathering a small group of people who cared, shop owners, neighbors, and even a few young volunteers from the community center. They formed a quiet network, making sure Mr. Harlan had food, fresh water, and a warm blanket at night. Evelyn arranged for someone to check on him regularly, ensuring he wasn't completely alone anymore. But the more she did, the more resistance she faced. Some local business owners weren't pleased. They complained that her focus on helping one man was distracting from what really mattered: profit. They worried that if more homeless people saw kindness in the area, it would hurt their businesses. Others warned that the redevelopment plans for the neighborhood wouldn't welcome problems like Mr. Harlan. Despite the pushback, Evelyn pressed on. She spoke to community leaders and even reached out to a local news reporter, Sarah, hoping that sharing Mr. Harlan's story might spark change. But soon after, she received another warning, this time more direct. One night, as she locked up her store, she noticed a black car parked across the street. It had been there for hours, the engine running, but no one stepping out. A chill ran down her spine. The next morning, fresh graffiti covered the back wall of her store. Words like, "Mind your own business," were painted in large, angry letters. Her stomach twisted with unease. It wasn't just about disapproval anymore. Someone was actively trying to intimidate her. Then, something strange happened. The stray dog, always focused and determined, suddenly wasn't alone. A second dog, lean and hesitant, had begun following it. Evelyn watched as they both arrived at Mr. Harlan's building, this time leaving behind 2 separate food offerings. The sight stirred something deep inside her. Had this second dog been watching all along? Had it been waiting for a chance to help? Or was there someone else in need? She couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just one man and one dog. The tension in the community grew, and Evelyn felt it every day. People whispered when she walked by. Some praised her for what she was doing, while others called her foolish. But she refused to back down. One evening, she gathered a few of the shop owners for a meeting, hoping to make them understand. She explained what had happened to Mr. Harlan and how their own businesses could be at risk if they ignored people in need. "We're a community," she said, her voice steady but firm. "If we don't look out for each other, what are we? Just a collection of buildings and businesses, or are we people who care?" A few nodded in agreement, but others remained unmoved. "You can't save everyone," one man said, "and if you try, you'll lose everything." The words stung, but she knew they weren't entirely wrong. She was risking her business, her reputation, and possibly even her safety. But what was the alternative? Turning away and pretending not to see? That wasn't an option. As the days passed, the threats continued. More notes slipped under her door. More strangers loitered near her store after dark. And yet, Evelyn stood her ground. Then, the worst happened. One night, someone broke into the local community center, the very place where volunteers had been organizing efforts to help people like Mr. Harlan. Windows were smashed, supplies were destroyed, and a note was left behind. "This is your last warning." The message was clear: stop helping or face the consequences. But instead of fear, it ignited something else: anger. The next day, Evelyn went public. She told the full story to the reporter, Sarah, who wasted no time publishing an article about the intimidation, the threats, and the people behind them. The news spread quickly, and suddenly, the story was bigger than just their neighborhood. People from nearby towns started paying attention. Social media lit up with discussions about kindness, responsibility, and the dangers of ignoring those in need. But while some supported her, others pushed back harder. That evening, the black car returned. This time, a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a dark jacket, and his expression was cold as he approached Evelyn outside her store. "You need to stop," he said, his voice low and controlled. "This isn't your fight." Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. "This is my community," she replied. "That makes it my fight." The man stared at her for a long moment before shaking his head and walking away. But Evelyn knew this wasn't over. She had struck a nerve. That night, as she sat in her office, exhausted but determined, she heard a quiet noise outside. Stepping out, she found the stray dog waiting near the back door. It looked up at her, its eyes calm, yet filled with something she couldn't quite describe. Understanding, maybe. She knelt down, gently scratching behind its ears. "You're not giving up, are you?" she whispered. The dog simply wagged its tail and trotted off into the night, once again carrying its small offering of food. Evelyn took a deep breath, realizing something profound. This wasn't just about Mr. Harlan. It wasn't even just about kindness. It was about standing up against the idea that some lives mattered less than others, and no matter what threats came her way, she wasn't going to back down. The tension in the neighborhood was at an all-time high. Evelyn knew she was being watched, but she refused to back down. The threats, the vandalism, and the warnings weren't enough to make her stop. If anything, they only proved that she was doing something that mattered. The night after her confrontation with the man in the dark jacket, she received another note under her door. "This is your last chance. Stop now, or face the consequences." She read the words slowly, then placed the note on her desk. Fear crept into her mind, but she pushed it aside. If she stopped now, what would happen to Mr. Harlan? What would happen to the others like him? The ones no one noticed, the ones left behind. That evening, she decided to call a community meeting. She invited local shop owners, volunteers, and neighbors who had shown support. Even those who had remained silent were welcome. If they were going to stand against this, they had to do it together. The meeting took place in the back of her store, the same place where she had first discovered the stray dog's secret mission. The room was packed with people, some whispering nervously, others standing with determination. Councilwoman Ramirez was there too, ready to take action. "We are at a crossroads," she began. "This isn't just about one man or one dog. This is about what kind of community we want to be. Do we let fear control us, or do we stand together?" Murmurs filled the room. Some nodded, others remained skeptical. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mr. Harlan himself spoke. His voice was quiet, but strong. "I spent years believing no one would remember me," he said, "that I was just a shadow. But someone did. A stray dog cared more about me than the people I once called my neighbors. That should make us all stop and think." The room fell silent. His words carried the weight of truth. But before anyone could respond, a sudden commotion outside made everyone turn their heads. A car screeched to a stop near the store. The same black sedan. The same looming presence. The crowd grew tense as the man in the dark jacket stepped out. This time, he wasn't alone. A few others joined him, their expressions cold and unreadable. Evelyn stepped forward, refusing to let fear show. "This ends now," the man said. "You've done enough." The crowd behind Evelyn murmured, shifting uneasily. But before the tension could explode, a new sound cut through the night. A low growl. The stray dog stood at the edge of the alley, its body tense, its eyes locked on the intruders. And behind it, the second dog, the lean, nervous one, stood too. It was as if they knew what was happening, as if they understood the danger. The man in the dark jacket hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. And then something unexpected happened. The crowd, once uncertain, began to step forward. First one, then another. Soon, Evelyn was no longer standing alone. The people of the community, shop owners, volunteers, and neighbors stood with her, forming a wall of silent resistance. The man in the dark jacket clenched his jaw, looking around at the united front. He had expected to intimidate one person. He hadn't expected to face an entire community. "This isn't over," he muttered, stepping back toward his car. Councilwoman Ramirez pulled out her phone. "You're right," she said. "It's not. Because from now on, we're watching you." The man gave her a long, hard stare before getting into his car and driving away. His threats had failed. A ripple of relief spread through the crowd. Some people cheered quietly, others simply exhaled the breath they had been holding. Evelyn turned to Mr. Harlan. He looked stunned, as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," she said. The stray dog trotted forward, nudging against Mr. Harlan's leg. He knelt down, running a trembling hand over its fur. Tears welled in his eyes. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. Evelyn shook her head. "Everyone deserves kindness." In the days that followed, the community continued to stand together. Local authorities got involved, and the people behind the threats were investigated. The redevelopment plans that once threatened to erase the neighborhood were adjusted, ensuring affordable housing and protection for those in need. Mr. Harlan, once forgotten, was given a second chance. With the help of volunteers, he moved into a small, safe home. He was no longer just a shadow in the alley. He was part of the community again. And as for the stray dog, it still made its daily journey, but this time it wasn't stealing food. Instead, it was welcomed. Shop owners left out fresh bowls of water and food. Children stopped to pet it. It had become a symbol of something bigger, a reminder that even the smallest act of kindness could create ripples of change. One evening, as the sun set over the neighborhood, Evelyn stood outside her store, watching as the dog trotted down the alley, its tail wagging. She smiled, knowing that none of this would have happened if she hadn't followed that dog, if she hadn't paid attention, if she hadn't cared. Because sometimes it only takes one act of kindness to start a movement. And this was just the beginning. This story proves that even the smallest act of kindness can change lives. If it touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Let's spread the message of compassion together.